Welcome back to Right on the Edge. My name is Derek, and I just discovered, obviously, this is old and not new, but I just discovered that Ford tried to make its own city in the Amazon. So I'm going to watch a more neutral version right here. I'm going to watch the dark truth right there. Uh, I'll watch this Dream Lost in the Jungle right there, and then I'll watch this really funny short. At least it looks funny. And that's how I'll do it. So I'll go good, bad, AI looking floating head. Nope.
Buried deep in the Brazilian jungle sit the remains of what was once Henry Ford's utopian city, a place where one of the richest and most influential men on the planet wanted not to make money, but to, quote, help develop that wonderful and fertile land. And I can tell you right now that Henry Ford definitely didn't make any money out of his
I'm gonna bet that he also wanted money.
dream city. In fact, it turned out to be one of his biggest failures, but we'll get to that later. So stick around until the end of this video to find out the story of Fordlandia, an American attempt at making an
Fordlandia, though, man. They should have picked a better name. That's for sure.
American rubber factory and an American-style community in the heart of the Brazilian Amazon. It's the early 1920s and Britain's stronghold on global rubber is still alive and well after holding a monopoly for decades with its plantations in the Far East and fixing prices at a high level. But even so, Henry Ford's automotive business is booming.
I mean, shit, dude. You have to do what you gotta do, I guess. That's probably why they wanted this jungle base now.
And he needs a lot of rubber for his cars and as cheap as possible for making tires, gaskets and valves. In fact, it's estimated that 3/4 of all the rubber imported into the United States at this point was used in the auto industry. So Henry Ford set out to find a way to cut costs and provide a steady supply of natural rubber for his business.
That makes sense.
And apparently the answer to all of this was simple. Build an American rubber plantation on a 1 million hectares piece of land in the Brazilian rainforest.
1 million hectares. I wonder what that translates to in English land. Mm. 100,000, there we go. So 2,471,053 acres. That's big.
Forest that would be called Fordlandia. So in 1927, with high spirits and overwhelming positive news coming from the Brazilian press, Henry Ford announced that he would embark on a tour of South America that included the site of the plantation. But this would end up to be the first misstep because the tour never happened. In fact, Ford never set foot on the utopian city he envisioned. At this point, you should know that Brazil used to be the #1 source of
So another CEO, another lie. Who would have guessed?
Natural rubber for the whole world, but its spot as the leader was taken by the British, who started producing its own rubber in the Far East, where pests and plant diseases that were the usual suspects for rubber tree deaths were non-existent. So their plantations
I always forget that rubber trees exist, and that's where it comes from.
thrived, whereas Brazil was left behind. Another thing you should know is that Henry Ford, as witty as he was, had no clue about how to grow rubber trees and no idea about how the local population was living. And he really had no trust in experts and advisors.
Okay, I'm not sure about that. I bet you had ideas about how they were living.
that tried to warn him about the potential failure Fordlandia could become. So the plan went ahead, and in August of 1928, two ships filled with everything from doorknobs to clothes set sail for the Amazon to establish a settlement. Work began to clear the jungle in order to make room for the buildings that would be erected, but progress was slow, partly because the settlement's first manager, the Danish sea captain Einard Axholm, had no agricultural experience. The fact that the site of
How did you get hired with no experience?
Fordlandia was on top of a rise didn't help with the construction effort either, because it was too far inland for cargo vessels to haul materials on the rocky Tapajos River before the rainy season. Because of this, food supplies were dwindling fast, and the crew assembled at the future site of the city revolted in late 1928. It would be just the start of local uprisings at Fordlandia. Materials finally began to arrive in early 1920.
That whole uprising. That's what happens when you don't feed people.
And the basic street grid was laid out, as well as a separate neighborhood for the American staff that worked there, called the Villa Americana. It had the best view of the city and was the only section with running water.
Wow. Okay, come on. That's... Come on.
Whereas the Brazilian workers who, to be fair, were given free housing, had to make do with water from wells. By the end of 1930, Fordlandia featured modern hospitals with over 100 beds, schools, generators, a sawmill, and its landmark structure, the water tower, which
I mean, that's not all that bad, but still, there's some bias going on.
is still in place today. All seemed well and good until this point, 2 years after work began, but there were underlying problems that everyone seemed to miss at the time. Although Ford was paying local employees a wage of 35 cents per day, much more than the typical 20 cents per day in the Far East, and offering free food, housing, and medical care, it was far short of the $5 per day earned by Ford employees in America. Moreover, the houses they built were sitting on the ground as opposed to the local way of building places above the ground to avoid creatures crawling inside.
I imagine it's also to avoid like flooding and damages caused like that
During the night, and there was a strict meatless diet enforced, as well as a prohibition on alcohol. All of these, plus the
Come on, you can't do that.
promotion of square dancing, poetry reading, and a 9-to-5 work schedule, led to a violent uprising at the Workers' Cafe, which quickly escalated and resulted in the vandalizing of the city, with generators and manufacturing equipment being destroyed. The American managerial staff successfully escaped by ship, and the violence finally stopped, but only when the Brazilian military was flown in by Pan Am. Now, a small explainer is in order, at least when it comes to that 9-to-5 work schedule that contributed to the violence. In the United States, a lot of people are accustomed to this type of schedule, but in the Amazon, people like to work before sunrise and after sunset because the heat and humidity during the day is really hard on the human body, and not many people can resist the conditions.
Oh, wow. Interesting. I would like to know more about that at some point.
The alcohol ban also played an important role in triggering the
Yeah, that would do it. Yeah, you can't take away people's vices and make them work what they don't want to work.
1930 violence, but eventually local workers circumvented the ban by setting up their own Island of Innocence 5 miles upstream from Fordlandia,
Isle of Innocence, that's crazy.
with bars, nightclubs, and even brothels. But
I knew it. Island of Innocence, man. That's telltale of a... Look at that smile, bro. Even he's like, "Ugh, you fucking know it."
let's get back to the rubber, or at least what should have been rubber. You see, up until this point, the total production amounted to 0. Deforestation was slow and painful, the land was hilly, rocky, and infertile, and none
Infertile for rubber trees, I'm guessing, because obviously not infertile, because look at all those trees they had to remove.
of Ford's managers had knowledge of tropical agriculture. This led to the plantation of trees from seeds of questionable quality close together with the hope of getting a high yield. But in their natural environment, rubber trees grow apart from each other as a protection mechanism against diseases and pests. So in 1933, after multiple failures in Fordlandia, Henry Ford tried his luck once more downriver, acquiring new land and setting up a new settlement called Belterra. This time around, he consulted Dr. James Weir, a plant pathologist.
Should have done that the first time. Save a lot of money.
He managed to get his hands on 2,046 buddings from high-producing trees in the Far East and brought them back to Brazil to start growing at Belterra.
That probably won't work that well.
And while Fordlandia wasn't completely abandoned, it was clear that Belterra was a better place to produce rubber, so the major operations were transferred here, and by 1940, 2,500 employees were working at Belterra, while 500 were still at Fordlandia. In 1942, 14 years after this whole adventure began, the first commercial tapping of rubber trees finally began, and 750 tons of latex were produced. It seems like a lot, but it was well short of the
it's a lot, but not after 14 years, you know?
38,000 tons Ford needed every year for his car business. And even though Belterra was producing rubber, it was still plagued by leaf fungus problems and production was slow, although it had a good chance of becoming profitable, seeing how World War II cut off the supply of rubber from the Far East. But in the end, it was a complete failure. After the war ended, Henry Ford was in poor health, and management of the company fell to his grandson, Henry Ford II, who set out to cut costs as much as possible, and the first on the chopping block was Fordlandia. Ford sold the land back to Brazil in 1945 for a mere $250,000, a fraction of the $20 million invested over time in the Amazon. That's over $200 million in today's money. Ford's dream cities had at their peak a total of 7,000 inhabitants.
Wow. Way to not win there, huh? Alright, where's that? That's like a short dictatorship. Ah, yeah, the dark truth.
This is the story of Fordlandia, a utopian experiment that spiraled into chaos. Today, we're talking jungles, rubber, riots, and what happens when you try to impose your vision of perfection on nature. Let's set the stage. The 1920s were all about innovation.
I don't know about on nature, but he definitely tried to put American values in a culture that wasn't American.
And Henry Ford was at the top of his game. But there was a problem: rubber. Ford needed a lot of it for his Model Ts, and the British controlled most of the world's supply in Southeast Asia. So Ford thought, why not grow our own rubber? And while we're at it, let's build a self-sufficient American town, complete with white picket fences.
I mean, dude, he was at the top of his game with a lot of money, you know? So it's like, I bet you, at the time, this seemed like a great idea.
In the heart of Brazil. The Amazon seemed perfect. Lush, green, and full of wild rubber trees. But here's the thing about the jungle. It's not exactly friendly. Ford's team didn't understand the terrain. They planted rubber trees close together.
And as part of it, they also didn't have any background in agriculture, as we learned from the other video.
Like you do on a farm back home. But in the jungle, this turned into a buffet for pests and fungi. And don't get me started on the heat, rain, and mosquitoes. Ford wasn't just growing rubber. He wanted to create a perfect American town. Think prefab houses, schools, and even a golf course.
Well, he did do the schools and stuff. I mean, I don't know why they promoted square dancing, but the schools, I think, are arguably a good thing.
Sounds nice, right? Except this was the Amazon. Ford imposed strict rules. No alcohol, no dance.
No alcohol is crazy. No. You could dance. Just only square dancing.
And a rigid 9-to-5 schedule. Local workers, used to their own rhythms of life, weren't thrilled. The frustration boiled over. Workers rioted, smashed property, and turned Fordlandia into a jungle version of The Office. Financially, Fordlandia was a disaster. The remote location meant everything. Building materials, food, even clothes had to be shipped in. Meanwhile, the rubber output was basically zero.
Zero for years, okay. They started making something at the end when they switched locations.
The Brazilian government initially supported the project, but as Fordlandia became a global joke, they distanced themselves. Ford's dream of beating the British rubber monopoly never happened. So, what happened to Fordlandia? Today, it's a ghost town. The jungle has reclaimed most of the buildings, but a few hundred people still live there, using what's left of the
Oh, wow. I didn't know a few hundred people live there. That's cool.
infrastructure. Interestingly, Fordlandia has become a symbol of corporate hubris, failed utopias, and even
Well, you know, there wasn't really a dark truth there. The insane truth of the little clickbait's probably a little bit better, a little bit more accurate, I would think. But let's see the then and now, I guess. Oh wait, no.
Buried.
No. That's right.
In the late 1920s, the auto magnate Henry Ford tried to create a utopian rubber plantation known as Fordlandia in the Brazilian Amazon.
Just to see if there's any more information, or if at least this is funny. It could be funny.
Yeah, it went as badly as you're imagining. Early construction stalled due to the remote site not having the equipment to unload the riverboats full of building
Yeah, we learned this.
materials, and the manager's attempt to slash and burn the jungle failed because
We didn't learn this. We did not learn this, but I imagine it would fail considering it's a wet rainforest.
they tried to do it in the rainy season, so instead, they just flooded the jungle with kerosene, causing a massive forest
Wow. Okay, yeah, the other video didn't go into that. That's cool.
fire. But even
And by cool, I mean that's crazy stupid, but it's interesting.
once the Midwestern-style town and rows of rubber trees were planted, the jungle itself fought back, while Ford imagined a worker's paradise.
The jungle.
What he'd actually created was a paradise for caterpillars that wanted to feed on rubber trees. Seriously,
there you go.
bonfires of gathered caterpillars regularly lit the Brazilian nights. Also, neither Ford nor his managers realized that latex collected at the bottom of trees in the cool pre-dawn hours, which is when native tappers worked. Instead, they forced their workers to work 9 to 5 through the punishing heat of midday for little gain. A revolt was coming, and to hear all about the brutal death of Fordlandia next week, hit that subscribe button. In the late 1920s, the auto magnate Henry Ford tried to create a utopian rubber plantation known as Fordlandia.
Alright, well, shit. We learned what we can learn. I guess that's all there is to know about Fordlandia. His naming person was probably sick that day. That's all I have to add to that.